How's everybody doing today? Good. It's good to be back here. Today we are going to be looking at political cartoons, the brief history of American political cartoons. Now, we are in a very political age, you may have noticed. And a lot of the issues that we are facing today are complex. It's the same thing throughout history, though. Throughout American history, there have been very complex political, social issues that have been dealt with by American society. And oftentimes, reading about those issues can take a lot of effort. But cartoon artists, editorial cartoonists, are often able to distill many of these complex issues into neat, fun-looking little drawings that tell us the story of the time period and that highlight some of the issues of a political question or whatever. So today what we're going to be looking at is the history of American political cartoons from the beginning pretty much up to the present day, and kind of jumping around looking at different historical topics and how those are reflected in the cartoons. Now, when you look at American political cartoons, it's kind of neat because you can tell the history of the United States just by looking at these drawn images, by looking at these political viewpoints that are created by various artists. So as we make our way through this, we're going to be looking briefly at the history of the United States from our earliest beginnings pretty much up to the modern day. Now, where does the history of American political cartooning actually begin?
Revolutionary War?
It was actually even before the Revolutionary War. The first American political cartoon is this one. Join or Die. This cartoon was created in 1754 by a guy you probably never heard of. His name was Ben. He was from Boston but moved to Pennsylvania later. Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was, kind of not surprisingly, the first American political cartoonist. He was involved in a little bit of everything. Now, what's going on here in the Join or Die cartoon? What's the point of the message there that Benjamin Franklin is publishing? Now, the Albany Congress of 1754 was a meeting held in Albany, New York, with representatives from some of the 13 colonies. And the goal that was put forth at the Albany Congress was that the colonies, which were all independent political units, should join together to create one super colony. Now, why would they want to do that? But for defense, for mutual defense. What's going on in North America in the 1750s?
Indian Wars,
The French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, that international colonial competition between Britain and France. And a lot of that violence, a lot of that tension was being fought on the frontier from basically what is today Vermont, western New York, western Pennsylvania, even as far down as kind of West Virginia. There were incredible tensions, there was incredible violence, and the animosity between Britain and France was impacting the British colonies. So here at the Albany Congress, Benjamin Franklin proposes colonial unity. He says we should all join together so that we can survive. We should join or we will die. If you look at the image, you have the 13 colonies represented as the 13 different parts of the snake. New England is kind of lumped in together. Over here is the head of the snake in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. Notice there's no Georgia. Georgia was kind of a frontier area in and of itself at this time, and really we don't need Georgia to complete our snake. So Benjamin Franklin creates the first American political cartoon with this idea of colonial unity. Of course, it would take the colonies about 20 plus years before they finally act on this. The Albany Plan of Union fails. And it fails because the colonies were jealous of their own sovereignty, of their political independence. Massachusetts didn't want to be with New York. It's kind of the same today, I guess. But, they wanted to be separate political entities, so Benjamin Franklin's plan fails. But 20 years later, we begin to see a notion that the American colonists are in fact Americans, and that they are different than Great Britain. And we move toward the Revolutionary War. And that brings us into a new era of cartooning in North America. Here are two cartoons from that time period, from the Revolutionary War period. Now, how many of you have heard of the Boston Tea Party? Around here we hear about it a little bit because, you know, Boston. What's going on in this cartoon over here? Well, what's going on in the background? Tell? Looks like there's some tea being dumped into the harbor. Now, what was the cause of the Boston Tea Party? Why did the Bostonians get so upset?
They were taxing
Taxes.
American tea.
They didn't like to pay their taxes. Now, kind of ironically, the Tea Act of 1773 doesn't actually raise the tax on tea. It's a misconception. What it does is it lowers the tax on East India tea, tea that's imported by the East India Company. By lowering that tax, it made the East India Company tea less expensive. And the idea was that then everybody would buy the East India Company tea. But American colonists didn't like being told what to do, wanted to be able to buy whatever tea they wanted, felt that the attempt by the British government to force people to buy East India Company tea was basically an attempt to prop up the East India Company financially, and we rebelled. And in Boston, in December, a bunch of people disguise themselves as Mohawk Indians and go to the ships in the harbor and dump the tea into the harbor. Now, this image is called Bostonians paying the excise man. The excise man is the tax collector on luxury items. And what we see here is kind of a rowdy group of Bostonians forcing the tar and feathered crown tax collector to ingest the tea. In the background we have the Liberty Tree and this ominous noose hanging from the Liberty Tree. Now, the Boston Tea Party, of course, is widely celebrated here in Massachusetts and in the United States. How does Britain react to it? How does Parliament react to the Boston Tea Party?
Not well.
Not well. They're very unhappy. They're very angry. So Parliament passes a series of laws that come to be called, here we call them the Intolerable Acts. In Britain, they were called the Coercive Acts. Those laws were essentially meant to punish Boston. One of the things that the Intolerable Acts do is they shut down Boston Harbor. Ships are not allowed in or out of the harbor. Now, Boston was a seafaring town, relied on trade. If you close the harbor, what are you doing to Boston? You're essentially suffocating it. This second cartoon is called The Bostonians in Distress. And what does it depict? But the city of Boston, the citizens of Boston, encaged, hanging from the Liberty Tree. It's almost an identical Liberty Tree, actually. While British ships blockade the harbor, British soldiers and British cannon surround the city. The only lifeline that the Bostonians have, these guys over here on the boat, bringing them supplies, helping them out. So you have two cartoons from the period of the Revolution showing various aspects of the American revolt against British authority. Attacking the taxman and the aftermath of attacking the taxman. Here's another famous cartoon of the time period, reflecting the Intolerable Acts. It's called The Able Doctor, or America Swallowing the Bitter Draught. What's going on in this cartoon? Well, this prone figure here, this half-naked woman, represents America. America was often depicted as a loosely dressed Native American woman. So that's what we have over here. You have this guy, the soldier, holding a sword, and it says military law on the sword. In the background, you see Boston in flames, Boston cannonaded. You have various members of Parliament in British society there. And what are they doing? Well, this judge is holding down the symbol of America. Tea is being forced down her throat, while the able doctor over here is taking a peek up her skirt. Basically, this cartoon, it's dated 1774, you can see that there in the corner, is a protest against the Intolerable Acts, saying that Boston, the Americas, are being treated unfairly, unjustly, really disgracefully by Britain and by British policy. another cartoon from that period of the Revolutionary War. Well, how does the Revolutionary War work out? Who wins? We do. We gain our independence from Great Britain, we establish ourselves as an independent country, and things are great for a while. Because in the early 19th century, we are once again butting heads with Great Britain. And in 1812, we have the United States versus Great Britain, round 2. The War of 1812. Now, the War of 1812 was kind of a war fought to clean up some of the issues that were left behind by the Revolution that were emerging from the growth of American international trade and kind of maritime and territorial conflicts with Great Britain. When the United States declares war on Great Britain in June of 1812, Britain hardly notices. What's Britain doing in the middle of the 18 teens?
Fighting France.
They're fighting against Napoleon. They have bigger fish, bigger issues that they're concerned with. This little thing off on North America is a very minor conflict. In fact, the British don't even think about the War of 1812 all that much. Here in the United States, we think of it as our second war of independence. We have defeated the British once again, which we really don't, but that's a different issue. So when war is declared, many people here in the United States said, great, we'll teach Britain another lesson. We'll show them again. In fact, we'll give them a bloody nose. What do we see going on over here in this cartoon? This cartoon titled A Boxing Match, or Another Bloody Nose for John Bull. Well, you have James Madison, President of the United States, teaching King George III a lesson. Punching him in the nose, we have this effusion of blood, giving him a black eye, saying, we'll beat you again, just like we beat you the last time. Well, as we know, the War of 1812 doesn't quite work out like this. We have a hard time fighting against the British. In fact, the British in 1814 burn Washington, D.C. The White House and the Capitol building are burned by the British. So we're not really giving them a bloody nose. In fact, by 1814, the war is causing tremendous economic turmoil in certain parts of the United States. Here in the Northeast, New England, New Jersey, New York, areas that relied on commerce and trade for their economic well-being were suffering because who was our biggest trading partner? It had been Britain, but now we're at war with Britain, and Britain's not buying our American goods. So New England is suffering economically because of the War of 1812. The situation gets so bad, in fact, that in December of 1814, representatives from the New England colonies in New York, and I can't remember if New Jersey was there, but we'll just say they were, meet in Hartford, Connecticut to discuss how to solve the problem, to try to figure out an issue, figure out the question of how to solve the economic turmoil. Now, at this Hartford Convention in December of 1814, many ideas are floated around. There are suggestions for perhaps making a new constitutional amendment, making it illegal or unconstitutional for somebody for consecutive presidents to be from the same state. If we think about it, who had been president of the United States so far by 1812? George Washington, where was he from? Virginia. John Adams, where was he from? Thomas Jefferson, Virginia. James Madison. We have 3 Virginians. That's not good for New England, right? So some of the delegates at Hartford say maybe we should ask for a constitutional amendment so that we can't have Virginians being president all the time. In fact, who's the next president? James Monroe. Where's he from? Virginia. So yeah. So there was that idea of a constitutional amendment. There were ideas of other constitutional amendments to make it more difficult for a president to get a declaration of war. And there was even an idea floated by certain members at the Hartford Convention that if the government insists on continuing this war against Great Britain, maybe New England should secede from the Union. The specter of secession that we often link with the Civil War actually first rears its ugly head here at the Hartford Convention in 1814. And that's what this cartoon is depicting. It's called the Hartford Convention, Leap or No Leap. And what you see are the very much struggling New England delegates, some of them praying for guidance, some of them debating whether or not should we take this step, should we leap it back into the arms of George III? Do we break away from the United States and go back to Great Britain for our own economic necessity? Now, while the Hartford Convention is going on in Connecticut, over in Belgium, negotiations are underway to end the War of 1812. And in fact, on December 24th, 1814, a treaty is signed, the Treaty of Ghent, that officially ends the war. Of course, it will take several weeks for news of that treaty to come back to the United States so that we can know that the war is over. In the meantime, the Hartford delegates send a letter of complaint to the government in Washington, D.C., and down in New Orleans in early January 1815, Andrew Jackson defeats the British at the Battle of New Orleans. So by the time the Treaty of Ghent arrives in Washington and is ratified by the Senate, we have other political developments and a battle that is actually fought after the war ends. In the end, the War of 1812 is essentially a draw. What the Treaty of Ghent says is we'll just put things back the way they were before the war started. So any territory gained or lost will revert. Any ships gained or lost will revert. You can't bring back the dead, but we'll just put those people aside and we'll patch up our relationship as best we can. So the Hartford Convention is this minor event in history, but it has major repercussions because of that idea of secession. Now we'll jump forward a few years. We'll skip over the Monroe administration. We'll skip over John Quincy Adams. And that brings us to whom? Who's president after John Quincy Adams?
Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson. The Jackson administration. Andrew Jackson is one of the most controversial presidents in American history because he basically tried to strengthen the office of the president while dismantling the federal government. Kind of sounds familiar. In any case, Jackson had many supporters, he had many opponents, and he was portrayed positively and negatively in the political cartoons of the time period. For example, this image over here, called King Andrew I. Is that a positive image or a negative image of Andrew Jackson? Pretty negative. They show him as a king, a dictator, a monarch, of veto memory, born to command, had I been consulted. If you look carefully, he's treading upon the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. He wanted the power. He thought that he should be the one directing the government. On the other side, though, he did have broad popular support. And that's what this cartoon is showing. One of the big political issues during Andrew Jackson's administration was the Bank of the United States, the rechartering of the Bank of the United States. The Bank of the United States was this entity that had been created by Alexander Hamilton under George Washington. Andrew Jackson and his supporters hated the Bank of the United States because they thought it gave too much power to this corporation. And one of the goals that Jackson had was the dismantling of the bank. What we see in this cartoon is the bank collapsing in the background. Andrew Jackson waving an order to remove public monies from the bank, being cheered by this figure over here, a guy named Brother Jonathan. Brother Jonathan, another early stand-in for the United States. He's kind of a precursor to Uncle Sam. So we see a lot of Brother Jonathan. And in the background, you have the opponents of Andrew Jackson being crushed by the falling bank, the senators and congressmen who are against him, Nicholas Biddle, the president of the Bank of the United States, depicted like as a demon right there, while the entire structure falls down on top of them. So Andrew Jackson is one of those controversial figures, one of those controversial presidents in American history, again with supporters and with opponents. Now Jackson serves 2 terms as president of the United States. And in the election of 1836, he's not running for re-election. He decides to follow Washingtonian tradition. But he has a hand-picked successor, the guy that he wants to win. He picks Martin Van Buren to be the next president of the United States. Of course, it's the people that decide. Martin Van Buren has the support of Andrew Jackson. The election of 1836 is essentially a referendum on Jackson's legacy. You have Van Buren against William Henry Harrison. William Henry Harrison was himself a military hero from the War of 1812, the victor at the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. So he has this national reputation. And the election of 1836 ends up being somewhat of a brawl, as you see depicted here in this cartoon. What's going on here? Martin Van Buren fighting against William Henry Harrison. While the American public looks on, the immigrant Irishman over here, shown with the bottle, Andrew Jackson, and the frontiersman watching the fight, looking to see who will come out on top. Of course, it is Martin Van Buren who does win the election, becomes president in 1837, serves one term as president because Andrew Jackson's economic policies cause an economic collapse that falls into Martin Van Buren's lap. In any case, in 1840, William Henry Harrison runs for president again and is elected and proceeds to serve the shortest term in American history. He's president for all of 33 days because he decides to give the longest presidential address in American history, inaugural address in American history, some 2 hours, standing out in a driving Washington, D.C. rain. He was the oldest man elected president at that time. He was in his late 60s, and sure enough, he catches a cold and is dead a month later. So there's William Henry Harrison's presidency. That's pretty much the only thing that happened during William Henry Harrison's presidency. So now we will jump forward about a decade to 1848 and the end of the Mexican War. The Mexican War was a war fought between the United States and Mexico, ostensibly over the issue of Texas and the border of Texas, but the end result of the Mexican War was a completely one-sided American victory, United States victory. And as part of our victory, we end up acquiring the entire Southwest, land that includes New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, parts of Colorado, and parts of Wyoming. All of that was once part of Mexico, becomes part of the United States after the Mexican War. The treaty that ends the Mexican War is the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Now, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is really a fascinating document because it grants the United States all of that territory. But many Americans thought it was distasteful that we went to war and acquired territory. After all, we are a republic. We don't fight wars for land, we fight wars for ideas. So if we're going to acquire all of this land, we have to compensate Mexico for it. So we end up paying Mexico millions of dollars for their loss of territory in the Mexican War. Now what this cartoon is demonstrating is exactly that. Here you have Mexico, south of the Rio Grande River, and the peacemaker, this cannon, firing ammunition coming out of the United States Treasury, firing gold coins across the Rio Grande into the coffers of the Mexican government. All the while, these two people here, who were mediators in the dispute, are looking on. Can you identify either one of these? That looks like a queen, right? It's Queen Victoria. And this is the King of France, Louis Philippe. So you had these two European monarchs mediating the dispute, helping to negotiate the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo that is ended when the United States Treasury sends money into Mexico and we acquire all of this land here in the background going all the way out to the Pacific Ocean. So essentially the entire treaty is right there in that cartoon. Now, what we begin to see when we look at some of these issues is that sometimes you don't really get what's going on. Sometimes the meaning is a little bit hidden in the image itself. These are supposed to condense the images. They're supposed to make them easily understood. But unless you know the events of the time period, sometimes the cartoons themselves are a little bit dense. This one, kind of easy to get when you break it down. Mexico, the United States, the Rio Grande, Pacific Ocean, all of that. Ties in very much with the Mexican War. But as we'll see moving forward, sometimes the cartoons take a little bit more effort to decipher. Now, while the United States was winning the Mexican War and acquiring all of that territory to the west. We were also a growing nation population-wise. Lots of people were coming to the United States from other parts of the world, particularly from Europe, but also from Asia, from China. So what we begin to see by the middle of the 19th century is an influx of immigration to the United States. And of course, how do we, in the United States, treat immigrants? Are they welcome with open arms?
Poorly.
Generally not. Historically, there has been a strong anti-immigrant bias in the United States. And what we begin to see in the political cartoons of the middle of the 19th century is an expression of that anti-immigrant bias. Now, what were the two largest immigrant groups coming to the country at that time? Well, from Europe, you had the Irish. The Great Potato Famine in the 1840s led to a spike in Irish immigration in the United States by the 1850s. How did native-born Americans feel about the Irish? Not good. Why? What was the problem with the Irish?
They were Catholic.
They were Catholic. The United States was founded by Protestants. Those Anglicans, those Puritans, the ones who established Massachusetts, had a profound distrust, perhaps an open animosity toward Catholics, toward Papists. So all of a sudden, you start having large numbers of Irish Catholics immigrating to the United States. And there was a deep fear among American Protestants. What was the fear? Well, that the Catholics would come in and they would be loyal to the Pope and not the government, not the United States, and that they would try to Catholicize America, such as we see in this image over here. What do we have? Here's our friend Brother Jonathan. Nice waspy American right there. And the school children, the youth of America right here. And who's getting off of this boat in the river or on the shores? Looks like a bunch of priests and bishops and cardinals and all of those guys bringing crucifixes and all of that. What was the big fear? Well, all of these Catholics are going to come over here and try to corrupt the youth of America. We don't like the Catholics, so we don't need them here. The other big immigrant group that was coming to the United States in the middle of the 19th century were the Chinese. They were coming across the Pacific and landing in California. Of course, what happens in California in 1849? The Gold Rush. The Gold Rush draws people to California, to the United States from all around the world. And you had tens of thousands of immigrants from China coming to California. Now, the Chinese weren't Catholic, right? So what's the problem with them? Well, they were even more exotic, even more different than the Irish. The Irish, at least, sort of speak English. We sort of have some connection with them. The Chinese, they are just different. They can never be part of American society. They can never fit in. So we have to fear them too. And that brings us to this cartoon over here, called The Great Fear of the Period. What does it show? Well, it shows the Irishmen and the Chinamen making their way across the United States. Now, this ties in with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, because what were the two big workforces of the Transcontinental Railroad? Well, coming out of the east and heading west, you had Irish laborers. Coming out of the west and heading east, you had Chinese laborers. There was this fear that the two would make their way across the country, essentially devouring Uncle Sam as they went. And then when they meet up in the middle, well, what happens? The Chinaman eats the Irishman. The great fear of the period. What are we going to do with these immigrants? Well, in the end, they will take over. They will destroy America from the inside. Now, some of the arguments against immigration that we hear in the 19th century, we hear again in the early 20th century, we hear again in the early 21st century. In many regards, there is an echo in American history when it comes to immigration, as we'll see in a couple of minutes as we move forward. So you have this issue of immigration. What was the other big social, political issue in the United States in the 1840s and 1850s? Slavery. The issue of slavery. Now this cartoon depicts the Democratic Party platform in the election of 1852. What's going on there? That's one of those cartoons that needs a little bit of deciphering, right? Need to identify some individuals. Well, who was the Democratic Party nominee in 1852? He wins the presidency. He becomes president in 1853.
Pierce.
Yes, Franklin Pierce. That's why you're sitting in the front row, right? Franklin Pierce. Franklin Pierce was the Democratic nominee. Well, who's this guy bowing down over here? It's Franklin Pierce. And what is Pierce doing? But he's bowing down over the Mason-Dixon line, kissing the foot of the slaveholder, while Satan emerges from hell, kind of blessing this entire scene. Here you have the ghost of Thomas Jefferson kind of bemoaning the position of the Democratic Party in 1852. And you have these three characters here in the background. This is Stephen Douglas. We all know Stephen Douglas. He gets into debates with Lincoln later on, 1858. This is Lewis Cass. Cass was the Democratic Party nominee for the presidency in 1848. Unsuccessful. This guy is General Haynau, who was a Austro-Hungarian general. Now, what is he doing in this cartoon about American politics? And why is he wearing a pitcher on his head? Now, Haynau is actually a European figure. 1848 in Europe was a year of revolution. There were popular uprisings throughout Europe, in France, in Hungary, in Italy. And the powers that be, the governments, the monarchical governments in all of those places tried to put down these popular uprisings. Haynau, an Austrian general, is sent into Hungary to crush the Hungarian uprising. And he does so with extreme brutality. Now, he was distinguished for his facial hair. He wore his mustache kind of long and off to the side like this. So people knew what he looked like. Well, after putting down this rebellion in 1848, around 1850, he makes a voyage to England, to London, and he goes to visit one of the important factories in London. The Barclays Brewery was considered one of the wonders of 1850s or mid-century England, this vast enterprise. So he goes to Barclays to visit the brewery, as many other tourists did in London at that time. But he is identified. The workers at Barclays knew him. They recognized him because of his distinctive facial hair. And what do? But they begin throwing teapots at him and throwing pitchers at him and beating him up because he was a figure of such violence in his putting down of rebellions. He was seen as so anti-Republican, anti-popular government that the factory workers turned on him and beat him up. So he comes to symbolize, in these political cartoons, political repression and all that is bad about power. And here he is showing up in an American political cartoon. So in 1852, the Democratic Party decides we are not going to take a stand on slavery. We'll let slavery expand. If it needs to expand, we'll let it stay where it is. The other parties that are running in 1852 basically were trying to contain the growth of slavery. Well, who wins? Franklin Pierce becomes president. Slavery continues unchecked throughout the United States until the election of 1860. But we'll get to 1860 in a minute. 4 years after this one, after this election, we have the election of 1856. And again, the main political issue in the United States is slavery. Now, in 1856, a new political party emerges and for the first time nominates a candidate for president. That is the Republican Party. And the first Republican nominee for president was a guy named John C. Fremont. He had been a general during the Mexican War. The Republican Party becomes the de facto anti-slavery party. They're the ones who want to check the growth of slavery in the United States. The Democrats are all for the growth of slavery. There is a third party that emerges in 1856, was the KnowNothing Party. The KnowNothing Party had one thing that they stood for. They were the Anti-Immigrant Party. So the election of 1856 is essentially a three-way race. The Democrats nominate James Buchanan, who was called Old Buck, a play on his name, and is depicted in these cartoons as a buck, a stag. the Know-Nothings nominate former President Millard Fillmore. Millard Fillmore isn't doing so well in the race over here. And the Republicans nominate Fremont, who has to kind of figure out what his party actually stands for. On the one hand, they're against slavery. On the other hand, they're kind of against immigration. So he's riding two horses at once. The Great Buck Chase, as it's called, of 1856, shows Buchanan clearly in the lead. And who wins the election of 1856? But Buchanan goes on to become one of the worst presidents in American history. So this is an illustration of the political chaos of the 1850s in the United States, with Fremont doing his circus act over there and Buck running away. Well, by 1860, everybody knows Buchanan's a terrible president. He's not running for re-election. And the election of 1860 will essentially be a referendum on the fate of the United States. There are four candidates who emerge in the election of 1860. Stephen Douglas is the Democratic nominee. There are two, I guess we can call them third and fourth parties. One nominates John C. Breckinridge, another is John Bell, and then the Republicans nominate, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln, who had lost a bid for the Senate against Stephen Douglas. Now, Lincoln is a figure that the cartoonists liked because he was easy to satirize. He was extremely tall, extremely gangly and lanky, and his backstory was kind of unique. He came from poverty. He was a backwoodsman who grew up with nothing, and as a youth had to teach himself to read and made a living by splitting rails. So he was sometimes called the rail splitter. So oftentimes when Lincoln is depicted in political cartoons, as you see here, he is shown as really, really tall and carrying a rail in his hand. Now, these two cartoons are about the election of 1860. This one is one of my favorites because it mixes politics and baseball. You see the national game, 3 outs and 1 run. Who are the 3 outs? Well, the 3 other candidates for the presidency. And who wins? Well, as it says at the bottom, Abraham winning the ball. The 1 run is Abraham Lincoln, combining baseball and politics. This one over here, again, shows the desperate efforts by the Democratic Party to prevent Lincoln from becoming president. It's called Storming the Castle. And you have Buchanan over here trying to pull Breckinridge into the White House, while Stephen Douglas and Bell are trying to jimmy the lock. And who's coming around the corner? But Lincoln carrying the rail. Who wins the election of 1860? But Abraham Lincoln. When Lincoln's elected, of course, that sparks South Carolina seceding from the Union, which eventually leads to the Civil War. Now, when the Confederate States are formed in 1861, they establish their own government and they elect their own president. Who was president of the Confederacy? Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis leads the Confederacy through 4 years of Civil War while Lincoln is trying to hold the Union together. Davis is trying to tear the Union apart. Well, by 1865, April of 1865, as the Civil War is clearly coming to an end, Union forces have marched through the South. Lee surrenders at Appomattox. Johnston surrenders at Durham. What happens to Jefferson Davis? Well, he tries to escape. He tries to run away. He leaves Richmond. He goes out. He goes into hiding. But he is eventually caught by Union troops. And that leads to this cartoon called President in Petticoats. Now, what is going on here? Well, this guy is supposed to be Jefferson Davis. Why is he dressed like a woman? Disguise. What's the story?
He was caught dressed in woman's clothes as a woman trying to escape.
That is the story that circulates. Now, what happens is that Jefferson Davis and his party are surprised by this Union troops, and Davis throws his wife's shawl over his head. Now, the story that begins to circulate in northern newspapers is that he was dressed in his wife's clothing, and the only reason he was caught was because the soldiers noticed the riding boots and the spurs, something that no genteel woman would wear. So this idea of Jefferson Davis in drag becomes fodder, a rich field for the political cartoonist, such as we see right here. There are several versions of this cartoon with Jefferson Davis wearing a dress. That leads us to another Jefferson Davis cartoon. This one, which is called Treason Toddy, or A Proper Family Reunion. And what do we see here? Here's Jefferson Davis, and what's he wearing? A dress and the boots and the spurs. Of course, he has some stolen Confederate gold here behind him. Stirring the treason toddy with this guy over here, Benedict Arnold. And who is blessing the union of Arnold and Davis? Well, you got Satan right there in the middle, and he says, I feel proud of my American sons, Benedict and Jeff. A cartoon damning Jefferson Davis, damning the Confederacy, tying them to the notorious traitor Benedict Arnold from the Revolutionary War. Great cartoon, potent, simple but very, very potent in its message. Now, the period after the Civil War is a period of tremendous social and political change in the United States. On the one hand, you have Reconstruction, where the federal government tries to remake the southern states, rebuild the southern states, reconfigure the politics of the South, and really of the nation as a whole. It's also the period of the Gilded Age, where there is tremendous wealth being accumulated by industrialists. It is a period of profound political corruption. If you recall, like a month ago, 2 months ago, whenever that was, I gave a talk on scandals, presidential scandals and political corruption. That brings us to the period of the Gilded Age and the role of political cartoonists during that time period. Perhaps nothing exemplifies the role of political cartoonists during the Gilded Age better than the work of Thomas Nast. Thomas Nast was a German immigrant to the United States who was drawing cartoons for New York newspapers and Harper's Weekly in New York City. New York City at that time was controlled by the Tammany Hall political machine. They basically controlled all aspects of New York City government. And the guy who controlled Tammany Hall was William Tweed, known as Boss Tweed, one of the most corrupt politicians in American history. How corrupt was Tweed? Well, it's estimated that during his time in control of Tammany Hall, he stole somewhere between $30 and $100 million from the treasury of New York City. Yeah, he was pretty good at doing what he did. Now, how did Tammany Hall, how did Tweed gain so much power, so much influence? They controlled voting blocks, and they took special interest in controlling the immigrants that were coming into New York City. Irish immigrants in particular became a potent force for Tammany Hall. Tweed and the judges on his payroll and other city officials would quickly grant citizenship to many of these Irish immigrants so that they could vote, and they voted almost exclusively for Tammany and the Democratic Party in New York, so Tweed had lots of power. Now, everybody knew Tweed was corrupt, but the scale of the corruption was truly astounding. And by around 1870, it starts to become apparent how much money Tweed and Tammany Hall are stealing from New York. So Thomas Nast, the political cartoonist who was a Republican, had it out for Tweed, begins to draw cartoons that attack Tammany Hall and attack Tweed himself, depicting Tweed, for example, as a bag of money. Cartoon is called The Brains, and what's the brains but the sack of money? It was money that allowed Tweed to maintain his position. It was bribery, it was graft that allowed him to control New York City. As Tweed himself said, I don't care a straw for your newspaper articles. My constituents don't know how to read, but they can't help seeing them damned pictures. Most of the immigrants that made up the voting blocks that Tweed courted were illiterate immigrants. So the newspapers exposing the wrongdoings in word, he didn't care. But when you start depicting Tweed as a bag of money, or as a Roman emperor, or the Tweed ring, pointing accusations around in the circle. Where'd the people's money go? Well, he took it. Oh, she took it. No, she took it. No, she took it. All the way down the line. That starts to illustrate the corruption of Tweed and Tammany Hall. And in fact, Nast's cartoons were so effective that in the election of 1871, the Democratic Party, the Tweed-backed candidates, lose most of their seats. Tweed's power essentially evaporates, and he becomes like the Roman emperor sitting in the ruins of what was once his empire. Now, Tammany Hall is just one example of corruption during the Gilded Age. There are many others, and the corruption almost always centered on money and power, as most corruption does. So this one is famously called the bosses of the Senate. Here you have all the senators at their desks, and who actually controls the Senate? But the trusts, the monopolies, the industries, these bags of money, the Steel Beam Trust, the Copper Trust, Standard Oil Trust, all of the corporations, using their vast resources, their wealth, they're buying the politicians, controlling government. This one is an illustration of the Credit Mobilier scandal of the 1860s and 70s. Credit Mobilier was a company that was set up to build the Transcontinental Railroad, was notoriously corrupt. Everybody in Washington wanted a piece of the Credit Mobilier pie. That's what we see over here. All the politicians trying to steal the pie while Uncle Sam is trying to guard the table. Unsuccessfully, people are coming in and sneaking off with vast amounts of wealth. Political corruption was everywhere during the Gilded Age, and it was carried out on a very public and professional level in many cases. And that brings us to another important trend of the late 19th, early 20th century. More immigrants. By the time we get to the 1870s, 80s, 90s, and early 20th century, immigrants are coming from other parts of Europe now, mainly Southern and Eastern Europe. So those Irish immigrants that had come in the middle of the 19th century have been replaced by Italian and Polish and Russian Jewish immigrants. All of them coming to the United States, trying to escape political violence and war and famine at home, looking for opportunity here in the United States. Now, how did native-born Americans react to this new wave of immigration? They're a danger. They're coming here to take our jobs. They're coming here to destroy the United States. In fact, these cartoons display some of that anti-immigrant sentiment. This one over here, you see the ratty-looking immigrant just coming off the boat, and what's he doing but stealing the bread and butter from the hard-working American's table. Same situation over here. The hard-working American with his wife and children has been fired by the industrialist because the industrialist is hiring this unskilled immigrant labor, which is very much cheaper than hiring the skilled American labor. And this image over here shows Uncle Sam clinging precariously to the rock as this wave of riffraff immigration pours in. If you notice on the rock it says, "Danger to American ideas and institutions." The immigrants, they're going to destroy America. They're going to take our jobs, they're going to make us all homeless, and they're going to destroy the very institutions of this country. Again, sounds familiar, doesn't it? The same story over and over again when we look at the history of immigration in the United States. Now, by the early 20th century, a figure emerges politically that is gold for political cartoonists. Figure of Teddy Roosevelt. When you think of Teddy Roosevelt, what image pops into your mind?
Oh, bully.
The big smile and the glasses, right? And the mustache. He was almost custom made for the political cartoonists. They loved him. They loved him because of his persona. They loved him because of his look. He was easy to illustrate. So what do we see over here but Teddy Roosevelt charging into battle in his costume of a Rough Rider from the Spanish-American War, heading into South America, knocking the European monarchies out of the way, sending Russia back to Russia and John Bull off that way. He was asserting American dominance in the Americas in this cartoon. Now, Teddy Roosevelt was a complex president. He was known to read 2, 3, 4 books a day in the White House, often wrote reviews of those books while president, was boundlessly energetic, and as president undertook many, many governmental and social reforms. One of the things that Teddy Roosevelt does is he begins to attack the monopolies, the trusts, to try to limit the power of the corporations. He becomes known as the trust buster. And what do we see over here in this cartoon but Teddy Roosevelt wrestling with the railroad trust while Uncle Sam watches from the sidelines. Teddy Roosevelt grappling with the power of industry. And again, reforming the financial sector of the United States. It's Jack and the Wall Street Giant. This is Teddy Roosevelt down here, facing off against the Vanderbilts and the J.P. Morgans and the Standard Oil guy whose name is escaping. Rockefeller, thank you. Against these powerful vested business interests. He's standing up for the rights of the American public against these powerful entities. Teddy Roosevelt, however, was also very much an imperialist. He saw America's destiny as expanding out into the world. He thought it was proper that the United States should be like the European powers and have territories around the globe. So under Teddy Roosevelt, we see a continuation of American international expansion. Roosevelt issues this thing called the Roosevelt Corollary, which was an add-on to the Monroe Doctrine. And in the Roosevelt Corollary, he said it is the right of the United States to intervene in the Americas when we see fit. Essentially, the Caribbean becomes our area of interest, and we will defend it carrying our big stick and our new Navy. Under Teddy Roosevelt, the American Navy modernizes. And in fact, that's what we see here. The American fleet heading out to sea. And who's the masthead of the ship right there? One Teddy Roosevelt, beaming as America, armored, sails out into the world, exerting our presence out to the 7 seas. Now, Roosevelt leaves or does not run for re-election in 1908. He could have, because he was not elected in 1900. He became president in 1901. But he decides not to run for re-election in 1908. He would later regard that as one of his biggest political mistakes. He nominates or chooses his successor, William Howard Taft. Roosevelt expected that Taft would continue his reforming policies. Taft, however, was a little bit more conservative. And when Taft runs for re-election in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt decides to run against him. He forms a political third party. It comes to be called the Bull Moose Party. So you had Taft, the Republican nominee, and Woodrow Wilson, the Democratic nominee, and Teddy Roosevelt carrying the banner of the Bull Moose. Well, in the election of 1912, Woodrow Wilson ends up winning. And he ends up winning largely because of the split in the Republican Party between the Roosevelt faction and the Taft faction. Interestingly, Taft lands on his feet. He is eventually appointed Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court by Woodrow Wilson. He's the only man to be both President and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Teddy Roosevelt, of course, leaves the doesn't run for public office again after 1912. He goes on to other adventures, but here you see the use of Teddy Roosevelt's visage, his face, by the political cartoonists. From Teddy Roosevelt, we'll jump forward a couple of decades to his distant cousin, Franklin Roosevelt. Another fan or favorite of the cartoonists. Of course, the cartoonists had Franklin Roosevelt around for a long time, since he's elected president 4 times. Serves in office for almost, sworn in 1933, dies in 1945, so he's president for more than 12 years. When Roosevelt runs for president, when he first becomes president in 1933, the country is mired in the Great Depression. And Roosevelt had promised during the election campaign to do something, to take action, to try to fix the economy. And what does he do? He introduces the New Deal. What was the New Deal but a concerted spending effort by the federal government to create jobs, to get people help, create social security networks, that sort of thing. Basically, FDR didn't really have a plan for what the New Deal was, but he was willing to try anything. So as we see in this cartoon over here, FDR is the doctor, Congress is the housewife, and Uncle Sam is the sick patient. And on the table are all the various medicine bottles for the different New Deal agencies, the NRA, the CCC, the FACA, the CW, all of that. All of those alphabet agencies. And what's Franklin Roosevelt telling Congress? Well, we'll try these, but we might have to change if these don't work. We'll try a different remedy later on. Here you have a avuncular FDR, very much like an uncle, surrounded by his adoring nieces and nephews, the various programs of the New Deal. Roosevelt tried to get the government to fix the economy, to get the economy back on sound footing, and was willing to try anything. But perhaps the thing that worked best was government spending, as we see in this cartoon over here. This rabbit has never failed me, old reliable. When you had a problem, how are we going to fix it? Well, the government will spend money. We'll pull this rabbit out of our hat. Sometimes Roosevelt had to guide Congress to do what he wanted them to do. And that's what we see illustrated here in this cartoon. Emergency legislation, Congress doesn't come easily, so Roosevelt has to drag them along behind him. He was trying everything to get the economy right. In the end, however, what actually ends the Great Depression?
World War II.
World War II. And that's what we see going on in the middle. Here you have, finally, congressional leaders riding the New Deal pony, looking rather battered there, out to pasture. And Roosevelt says, well, we don't need the New Deal anymore. Now we have to win the war. We have to focus on that. So these cartoons show how Roosevelt approached governing, how he had to drag Congress along, how he saw federal spending as a good thing, and how ultimately the New Deal meets its demise with the start of the Second World War, and how the Second World War really jump-starts the American economy. So there's FDR in cartoons. Now we move forward to 1972. What's going on in the United States in the 1970s?
Watergate.
Yeah, Richard Nixon. Of course, Nixon was easy for the cartoonists to satirize. He had that kind of droopy dog, long-nosed face that fit in with a Pinocchio over here, right? And of course, why is Nixon being depicted as Pinocchio? He was lying to cover up the Watergate investigation. And as more and more evidence came out, it became more and more apparent that he was lying. Here, this one, hearkening back to that Boss Tweed cartoon. You're following the trail of money, and who's up here at the top saying, I am not a crook? Richard Nixon with a money bag head. And here in the middle, again, I am not a crook. The missing 12 minutes of audio tape. I am a crook. So Nixon was an easy target for the political cartoonists, particularly during Watergate. The corruption and really kind of the ineptitude of the cover-up was good fodder. From Nixon, we'll get a little bit more recent. The election of 2000. How many of you remember the election of 2000? It was Al Gore versus George W. Bush. And what was the issue in the election of 2000?
Chads.
The Chads. We don't know who won. It was a long time before we figured out who won the election. So this cartoon, playing on a famous historical image, says Bush defeats Gore. No, Gore defeats Bush. No, it's Bush again. No, Electoral College defeats State U. No, it's Dewey over Bush. No, Nader beats Gore. There was confusion because we didn't know who actually won the election for several weeks after the election. And in fact, the issue does become Florida and those hanging chads. Now, kind of as a political aside, Had Al Gore won his home state of Tennessee in 2000, Florida would not have mattered. But he loses his home state, and that's what put Florida in play. But because Florida was in play, the entire country was suffering from what we could call electile dysfunction. In any case, the election of 2000 leads us to some comical political cartoons. Now, cartoons have often been used to criticize people in power, to call out confusion, but they can also act as unifying elements. They can express the ideas that many of us feel. And if we look at some of the cartoons that occurred after the terrorist attacks on September 11th, they do express the sentiment that most Americans felt during those frightening days in the fall of 2001. Here you see the Statue of Liberty, teardrop, watching as the planes crash into the Twin Towers. In this one, hearkening back to that famous photo from World War II, with the Marines raising the flag on Iwo Jima, shows the first responders raising the flag on the pile of rubble of the Twin Towers. So though the political cartoons could be acerbic, though they could attack political candidates and political ideas, they could also act as unifying elements, drawing the public together. And from September 11th, we will come up to the present day, looking at some of the last few presidents, from George W. Bush over there, and what happens to the United States under his watch. Global warming, torture, spying, Katrina, nuclear nonproliferation, to Barack Obama here stripping defense spending and walking away with the tires, to the tweeter-in-chief today, there in the bottom, in a very Nixonian pose, right, tweeting away. So, political leaders are fair game. They are easy targets for political cartoonists. In fact, the two go hand in hand. From the very beginning of political cartooning, from editorializing, political leaders have often been the fodder. Political ideas, social events, all of that is part of the story of the United States. And it is part of the story of the United States that has often been illustrated and critiqued and highlighted by these artists who create these cartoons. I want to leave with one last image that goes back to the 19th century, but it is an interesting picture. What's going on here? What's the basic image? Statue of Liberty. This cartoon actually talks about a situation prior to the building of the Statue of Liberty in New York. The story of the Statue of Liberty is that the statue itself was a gift from the people of France. But it was the people of the United States who had to build the pedestal, the thing that the statue was going to stand on. And in France, they raised money, built the statue, and shipped her to the United States. We hadn't done our part. We had not built a pedestal. Nobody was raising money for the pedestal. So this cartoonist came up with an idea. Why not let the advertising people deal with it? They will sell space on the Statue of Liberty for advertising, and then we'll get the money and we will be able to build the statue. In a way, the Statue of Liberty here kind of resembles a modern NASCAR driver, right, with ads all over the place. So we'll leave it with this kind of lighthearted image as we conclude this history of political cartoons in the United States. Now, does anybody have any questions? Any cartoons I missed that you wanted to see? All right, well, thanks a lot. I hope you found that at least entertaining. And political cartoons are great to look at. Sometimes difficult to understand, but fun to look at. So if you get a chance, go look for some political cartoons. Thanks a lot.
That quote from Von Tweed.
It's great, isn't it?